Sometimes it takes just one unreasonable barrier to transform my simple driveway into a money-making venture. I had barely stepped outside when I spotted Karen, our HOA board member, brazenly blocking my path with her makeshift road closed sign. The smug look on her face told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't maintenance, this was personal. If you've ever dealt with problematic HOAs or troublesome neighbors, drop a comment below sharing your story. Trust me, you're not alone in this battle. I purchased my suburban home 3 years ago with dreams of peaceful living. The colonial-style house with its spacious yard and quiet street seemed perfect for my family, my wife Lisa, our 2 kids, and our golden retriever Max. What I failed to investigate thoroughly was the iron grip of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. My first warning came during closing when my real estate attorney David pulled me aside with a concerned expression. "Just so you know, Jason, the road adjoining your property has a complicated zoning situation. Watch out for the HOA board, especially their vice president. She's been known to make life difficult." I brushed off his words with a casual laugh. How bad could it be? I'm a decent neighbor. David's eyes narrowed. "You haven't met Karen Wilkins yet." I would soon learn how prophetic those words were. Karen Wilkins wasn't just any HOA board member. She was a retired administrative assistant with nothing better to do than enforce every microscopic rule in our community's 87-page covenant. Our first encounter happened 2 weeks after moving in. I had placed our trash bins at the curb the night before collection, apparently 6 hours earlier than the 5 a.m. regulation permitted. The aggressive knocking at 9:30 p.m. startled Lisa and woke our daughter Emma from her sleep. I opened the door to find a petite woman in her 60s with a perfectly coiffed silver bob and a notebook clutched to her chest. "You must be the new owner," she said, not bothering with introductions. "I'm Karen Wilkins, HOA Vice President. Your garbage bins are in violation of Community Ordinance Section 4.12b. They cannot be visible before 5 a.m. on collection day." Before I could respond, she thrust a yellow warning slip into my hand. "First offense is a warning, second is a $75 fine. Welcome to Oakwood Estates." Lisa tried to smooth things over in the following weeks. She attended HOA meetings and even volunteered for the Community Garden Committee. Her efforts seemed to work until the driveway incident. Our house sits on a corner lot where Maple Street meets a small access road leading to 4 other homes. My driveway connects directly to this access road, which technically falls under HOA jurisdiction, but had never been an issue. Until the Wednesday morning when I found Karen standing beside a metal barricade blocking my driveway access. "What's going on?" I asked, already running late for a client meeting. Karen consulted her ever-present notebook. "Essential road maintenance. We've been planning this for months. Didn't you get the notice?" I hadn't received any notice, and judging by Karen's barely concealed satisfaction, that was intentional. "How long will this take?" I gestured toward my car, now trapped in my garage. "At least 2 weeks," she replied. "Maybe 3, depends on the contractor's schedule." 3 weeks? That's impossible. How am I supposed to get to work? She shrugged with practiced indifference. "You could park on Maple Street and walk around. It's not that far." For a family with 2 working parents and school-aged children, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a logistical nightmare. The alternative route meant parking on a busy street and walking nearly a quarter mile with groceries, school supplies, and everything else that normally came through our garage. That evening, I called an emergency family meeting. "This is ridiculous," Lisa said, pacing our kitchen. "There's no sign of any actual road work. She's just being vindictive because you questioned the community center budget at the last meeting." Our son Noah, 12 and already developing a keen sense of justice, looked up from his homework. "Can't we just move the barricade when she's not looking?" "That would give her exactly what she wants," I explained. "Documentation of a violation so she can issue a fine." Emma, our 9-year-old, sighed dramatically. "Dad, this is so embarrassing. Lily's mom had to walk me all the way around the block yesterday because they couldn't drop me at our driveway." The conflict wasn't just external. It was creating tension within our home. Lisa worried about maintaining peace in a neighborhood where we planned to live for years. I struggled between standing my ground and avoiding unnecessary battles. That night I called Tony Martinez, my college roommate, who now worked as a civil engineer specializing in urban development projects. "A power-tripping HOA board member?" Tony laughed when I explained the situation. "Classic suburban warfare." "It's not funny when you're living it," I replied. "She's making our lives miserable, and for what? Because she can?" "Look, these HOA types operate in a gray area. They have authority, but it's limited. Send me your property documents and the HOA covenant. Let me take a look." 2 days later, Tony called back with unexpected news. "So I reviewed everything, including your property's plat map and the county records," he said, excitement evident in his voice. "There's something interesting here. The access road is HOA property, yes, but your actual property line extends about 15 feet beyond your visible yard markers, underground. What does that mean? It means you own the subterranean rights to a portion of land beyond your fence line. In construction terms, you could potentially build something under that strip of land without HOA approval." I laughed. "What am I going to do, dig a tunnel?" The line went silent for a moment before Tony replied, "Actually, that's exactly what you could do." The idea seemed absurd at first, a private tunnel just to access my driveway, but as Karen's maintenance project dragged into its second week with no actual work being performed, the concept began to take shape. Tony visited the following weekend, bringing detailed geological surveys and architectural drafts. We sat in my basement, examining the possibilities. "The soil composition is ideal," he explained, spreading maps across my workbench. "Sandy loam with good stability. You'd need proper reinforcement, of course, but it's completely doable." "This can't be legal," Lisa interjected, looking over our shoulders. "That's the beauty of it," Tony grinned. "It absolutely is. Underground construction on your own property doesn't violate any HOA covenants because they simply never thought to restrict it. And the county building codes allow for auxiliary access structures with proper permits." "So I could build an underground driveway?" I clarified. "A short tunnel, yes," Tony corrected, "about 20 feet long, connecting your garage to the public street, completely bypassing the HOA access road." Lisa shook her head. "This sounds extreme, Jason. And expensive." "I have contacts," Tony offered. "Construction crews who do small specialty projects. It wouldn't be cheap, but considerably less than you might think." As we discussed logistics, Noah burst into the basement, his face flushed with excitement. "Dad, Karen's out there taking pictures of our yard. She says our grass is half an inch too tall." That was the moment something snapped inside me. The constant harassment, the petty rules, the deliberate obstruction, all because one person decided to make our lives difficult. "Let's do it," I told Tony. "Draw up the plans." Over the next several days, we developed our strategy. Tony arranged for an inconspicuous geological survey, disguised as a routine plumbing inspection. We submitted permit applications for an auxiliary egress structure to the county, vague enough to pass initial review but technically accurate. The real challenge was keeping our plans hidden from Karen's watchful eyes. She had recruited neighborhood allies who seemed to report our every move. Our garage became the center of operations, with planning sessions held after dark. Lisa remained apprehensive but eventually came around when Karen issued a violation notice for the children's basketball hoop, claiming it was 6 inches too close to the sidewalk. "I've tried being reasonable," Lisa said, tearing up the notice. "I've attended their meetings and brought cookies to their functions. Nothing works with her. Do what you need to do." 2 weeks later, our permits cleared. Tony arrived with a small specialized crew who had experience with wine cellar construction and small-scale tunneling projects. They came after hours in unmarked vans, carrying equipment in discreet containers. We began excavation inside our garage, removing concrete to create the tunnel entrance. The plan was to tunnel outward toward Maple Street, completely bypassing the access road Karen controlled. The dirt would be removed gradually, loaded into contractor bags, and disposed of legally at various construction waste sites. The operation progressed smoothly for 3 nights. We had nearly 15 feet of tunnel completed, properly reinforced with steel supports and concrete lining, when disaster struck. Karen spotted one of the contractors leaving our property at dawn. That afternoon, she appeared at our door with 2 other HOA board members. "We've received reports of unauthorized construction activity," she announced, attempting to peer past me into the house. "According to Section 7.3 of the Covenant, all exterior modifications require HOA approval." I maintained my composure. "We're doing interior renovations, nothing exterior." "Then you won't mind if the Architectural Review Committee takes a look," she insisted. "Actually, I would mind. This is private property and interior modifications don't require HOA approval." Karen's eyes narrowed dangerously. "We have the right to inspect if we suspect covenant violations." "You have the right to request an inspection," I corrected her. "I have the right to refuse. If you want to press the issue, you can have your attorney contact mine." It was a bluff. I didn't have an attorney on retainer, but it worked. Karen retreated, but not before issuing a thinly veiled threat. "We'll be watching closely." That night we held a crisis meeting in the basement. "She's suspicious," Tony acknowledged. "We need to accelerate the timeline." "How?" I asked. "We still have at least 10 more feet to go." Tony's expression turned serious. "We bring in more crew members, work around the clock in shifts. We can finish in 3 days if we push it." "The cost will double," Lisa pointed out. I thought about the weeks of harassment, the barricade still blocking our driveway, and the growing frustration in our children's eyes. "It's worth it," I decided. "Let's finish this." For the next 72 hours, our house became a covert construction zone. The crew worked in shifts, carefully excavating and reinforcing the tunnel. We installed lighting, drainage systems, and even ventilation. Tony's expertise ensured that every aspect met or exceeded safety codes. By Sunday evening, we had completed the tunnel, 22 feet of perfectly constructed underground passage connecting our garage to Maple Street, complete with a concealed entrance that looked like an innocent garden shed from the street side. As we celebrated quietly in the garage, Noah asked the question that would change everything. "Dad, what if other neighbors want to use it too?" I looked at Tony, who was already grinning. "Access control," he suggested. "Electronic gates at both ends. Programmable key fobs." "Like a private toll road?" Lisa asked. "Exactly," I replied, the idea taking shape. For those who've had enough of Karen's roadblocks. The next morning, as I prepared to test our tunnel for the first time, Karen appeared at my garage, a county inspector reluctantly trailing behind her. "We have reason to believe you've conducted unauthorized excavation," she announced triumphantly. "The county has agreed to investigate potential code violations." The inspector, a middle-aged man who clearly wanted to be anywhere else, sighed. "Sir, do you mind if I take a look at any recent structural modifications?" "Not at all," I replied calmly. "I'd be happy to show you our properly permitted auxiliary egress structure." Karen's confident expression faltered as I handed the inspector our county-approved permits and architectural plans. "This appears to be in order," the inspector noted, reviewing the documents. "Would you like to see the tunnel itself?" I offered. "Tunnel?" Karen gasped. "What tunnel?" I opened the garage door, revealing the well-lit, professionally constructed passage. Our alternative driveway access, fully permitted, structurally sound, and completely on our property. The inspector conducted a thorough review, checking reinforcements, ventilation, and drainage systems. "Impressive work," he concluded. "Everything meets code. You even exceeded safety requirements in several areas." Karen's face had transformed from smug certainty to shocked disbelief. "This can't be allowed. The HOA never approved this." "The HOA doesn't have jurisdiction over subterranean construction on private property," I explained. "It's not covered in the covenant." "He's right," the inspector confirmed, closing his notebook. Underground structures fall under county jurisdiction, not HOA, unless specifically addressed in your covenants. Karen stormed off, already on her phone, presumably calling the HOA's attorney. Within hours, news of our tunnel spread through the neighborhood. 3 of my neighbors, who had also experienced Karen's tyrannical rule, stopped by to see it. "You actually built an underground driveway?" Mark Wilson, who lived 2 doors down, asked in disbelief as he stared at the entrance. "Technically, it's an auxiliary egress structure," I corrected, using the official permit language. "But yes, it connects our garage directly to Maple Street. This is genius." Sarah Cooper, whose landscaping had been cited 14 times in the past year, whispered, "Karen must be losing her mind." "She's already called an emergency HOA meeting for tomorrow night," Mark informed me. "Says she needs to address a serious covenant violation that threatens community standards." I smiled. "I'll be there." That evening, Tony and I finalized our tunnel access system. We installed electronic readers at both entrances, controlled by a simple smartphone app. The system could issue temporary or permanent access codes and even collect small payments. "You realize what you've done, right?" Tony asked as we tested the system. "You've created the first HOA bypass utility. This could become a thing." I hadn't considered the broader implications, but he was right. In neighborhoods across America, homeowners struggled with overreaching HOAs. Our solution wasn't just about personal convenience, it represented something bigger. The HOA emergency meeting the following evening was standing room only. Neighbors who had never attended before showed up, curious about the rumored underground rebellion. Karen stood at the front, red-faced and clutching a thick binder. "As many of you have heard, we have a situation that threatens the very foundation of our community standards," she began, glaring directly at me. "One of our homeowners has constructed an unauthorized underground tunnel." Murmurs spread through the room. "I've consulted with our attorney," she continued, "and while the covenant doesn't explicitly forbid underground structures, we can amend it immediately to prohibit them and require removal of any existing ones." The HOA president, a retired judge named Walter Peterson who rarely involved himself in Karen's crusades, cleared his throat. "That would be ex post facto regulation, Karen. We can't retroactively prohibit something that was legal when constructed." "But the community aesthetic," Karen protested, "is not affected by an underground structure," Walter interrupted. "I've seen the tunnel myself. It's professionally built, properly permitted, and completely invisible from the street." "But if we allow this, what's next?" Karen's voice rose. "Underground swimming pools? Subterranean additions? We'll lose all control." The room fell silent until Sarah Cooper stood up. "Speaking as someone who's received 60, not 14 as some have said, landscaping violations in the past year, I think this is brilliant. The HOA controls too much as it is." Mark Wilson joined her. "I had to get 3 different approvals just to replace my fence with an identical one. Maybe a little less control wouldn't be the worst thing." The mood in the room had shifted. Neighbors who had suffered under Karen's rigid enforcement were finding their voices. Walter banged his gavel. "The tunnel doesn't violate our current covenant, and I'm not inclined to pursue retroactive amendments. The matter is closed." Karen stood frozen, her authority publicly challenged for the first time. As the meeting adjourned, she approached me with cold fury in her eyes. "This isn't over," she hissed. "I'll find a way to shut down your little tunnel." I met her gaze calmly. "The barricade blocking my driveway, the one for road maintenance that hasn't happened in 3 weeks, I expect it to be gone by morning." "Or what?" she challenged. "Or I'll start offering tunnel access to everyone affected by your arbitrary road closures at very reasonable rates." Her eyes widened as she realized the implications. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me," I replied. "I'm already getting requests." The barricade disappeared overnight. Karen maintained her surveillance, documenting every visitor to our house, hoping to catch some violation, but her influence had been irrevocably damaged. Word of our tunnel spread beyond our community. A local news station did a human interest story about the HOA tunnel, carefully framing it as a quirky home improvement rather than an act of rebellion. The reporter asked what had inspired such an unusual project. Sometimes, I told the camera, when you face an unreasonable barrier, you need to find a creative path forward. Our success with the tunnel didn't sit well with Karen. Despite losing the battle at the HOA meeting, she was determined to win the war. 3 weeks after the confrontation, I discovered security cameras installed on utility poles facing our property. When I contacted the power company, they confirmed the cameras weren't theirs. They'd been installed without authorization by a community member concerned about safety. It didn't take much investigation to trace them back to Karen. The cameras were positioned to monitor not just our driveway and the tunnel entrance, but also our front door and children's bedroom windows, a clear invasion of privacy that sent a chill down my spine. I documented their positions with photographs and had Tony verify that they were indeed transmitting video rather than being dummy cameras meant to intimidate us. "She's recording your family's movements around the clock," Tony confirmed after tracing the wireless signal to a receiver in Karen's garage. This goes beyond harassment into potential stalking territory. Tony suggested we could challenge the legality of her surveillance, but I had a different idea. "Let her watch," I told him, as we sat in my now famous tunnel, the soft LED lighting casting long shadows against the concrete walls. "The more obsessed she gets, the more mistakes she'll make. Napoleon once said, 'Never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake.'" Tony raised an eyebrow, unconvinced by my strategy. "Your enemy isn't just making mistakes, Jason. She's documenting your family's every move. There's a line between strategic patience and putting your family at risk." His concern was valid. The cameras represented an escalation I hadn't anticipated. Karen wasn't just fighting to maintain control of the HOA. Lisa wasn't so sure about my strategy either. "You're playing with fire," she warned one night after the children had gone to bed. We sat at our kitchen island, speaking in hushed tones as if Karen might somehow be listening. "Karen isn't going to just disappear because you outsmarted her once. People like that don't lose gracefully. They escalate until they get what they want or self-destruct trying." She reached across the counter and gripped my hand. "I supported the tunnel because it solved a practical problem, but now I'm worried we've awakened something darker in her. Did you see how she looked at us at the supermarket yesterday, like she was memorizing our faces for some kind of hit list?" She was right, of course. People like Karen didn't surrender power easily. They doubled down, became more entrenched, more desperate to regain control, and desperate people rarely played by the rules. The cameras were likely just the beginning. The first real escalation came when our property tax assessment arrived with a stunning increase. Our home value had allegedly jumped 60% in a single year, an astronomical and clearly targeted reassessment that would increase our annual property taxes by nearly $7,000. "This has Karen written all over it," I told Lisa as we stared at the notice, the official county letterhead doing little to disguise the personal nature of the attack. It wasn't far-fetched to imagine her having connections at the tax assessor's office. She'd mentioned her cousin worked in county administration during an HOA meeting months earlier when boasting about her civic connections. We filed an appeal, providing comparable home values in the neighborhood that clearly demonstrated the inconsistency of our assessment. The adjustment would take months to process, potentially leaving us on the hook for inflated payments in the interim. Then came the anonymous reports to various regulatory agencies, a barrage of complaints that kept our doorbell ringing with officials clutching clipboards nearly every day. First, a building code inspector arrived, citing complaints about unpermitted construction and potential safety hazards in our home. When our tunnel permits checked out and no violations were found, we received a visit from the health department investigating reports of standing water and potential mosquito breeding in our yard, a concern that seemed laughable given our meticulously maintained landscape. After that, animal control responded to complaints about an exotic pet operation supposedly being run from our garage, complete with allegations of snake breeding and illegal reptile sales. Each investigation found nothing, but the pattern was clear. Someone was determined to bury us in bureaucratic harassment. draining our time, energy, and potentially our financial resources as we defended against each new accusation. The breaking point came when Noah and Emma began finding notes in their school backpacks, typed messages warning them that your parents are breaking the law and your house might not be safe because of the dangerous tunnel. Noah, with his 12-year-old's developing sense of justice, recognized the intimidation tactic immediately and brought the notes to us with an eye roll and commentary about that crazy Karen lady. But Emma, at 9, was genuinely frightened. When she came home crying after finding one of these notes, with an ominous warning that sinkholes can swallow entire houses and the people inside them, something inside me shifted. One particular afternoon remains seared in my memory. Emma sitting on her bed, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit, asking in a small voice whether our house was going to collapse and if we should move away before the bad lady does something worse. Harassment was one thing, targeting our children was another entirely. That night, after consoling Emma and assuring her that our home was completely safe, I set up discreet cameras around our property. If Karen was escalating to psychological warfare involving our kids, I needed evidence. It didn't take long to catch her in the act. 2 days later, my phone alerted me to movement near our mailbox at 5:30 a.m., well before the usual mail delivery time. The footage showed Karen, dressed in a dark jacket with the hood pulled up despite the mild morning temperature, slipping an envelope into our mailbox before hurrying away with the furtive movements of someone who knew they were crossing a line. I retrieved it immediately, another anonymous warning about dangerous underground structures and potential sinkholes threatening the entire neighborhood. The letter suggested concerned homeowners contact county officials to protect property values from reckless construction and included sensationalized news stories about tunnel collapses from around the world, none of which involved professionally engineered structures like ours. The paper was standard copy paper available anywhere, and the letter itself contained no identifying information, but the video evidence was irrefutable. Karen was now moving beyond harassment to what could potentially be considered mail tampering, a federal offense. With Karen's harassment now documented, I consulted an attorney specializing in property disputes and harassment cases. Jessica Reynolds reviewed our evidence with the clinical detachment of a seasoned legal professional, but even her professional demeanor slipped when she watched the video of Karen terrorizing our children with threatening notes. "This is textbook harassment and potentially stalking," she said, removing her glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. The unauthorized surveillance, the false reports to regulatory agencies, the manipulation of tax assessments, all troubling but still mostly in the realm of civil disputes. But the notes to your children could be considered endangerment of minors. You have grounds for a restraining order, civil damages, and possibly criminal charges for intimidation and interfering with mail. I considered my options carefully. Legal action would be satisfying but potentially drag on for months or years, creating a public spectacle that might affect our children even more than the current harassment. I wanted something more immediate, something that would resolve the situation decisively while sending a clear message that targeting my family had consequences. That's when I received an unexpected call from Walter Peterson, the HOA president. His voice sounded strained on the phone, the usual judicial confidence replaced with what seemed like genuine concern. "Jason, I need to speak with you privately. It's about Karen and some HOA funds. Can we meet somewhere outside the neighborhood?" The urgency in his tone suggested this wasn't a minor issue. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop across town, away from prying eyes and potential eavesdroppers. Walter arrived looking decidedly uncomfortable, his normally impeccable appearance slightly disheveled, as if he'd dressed in a hurry or hadn't slept well. After ordering coffee and ensuring we had a private corner table, he shared stunning information that changed my entire understanding of Karen's motivation. "I've been reviewing our financial records after some homeowners raised questions about the community center renovation budget at the last meeting," Walter began, keeping his voice low despite the ambient noise of the busy cafe. "There are discrepancies, significant ones. Karen has been the treasurer for 7 years, and it appears she's been directing certain vendor contracts to companies owned by her family members at inflated prices. He slid a folder across the table containing photocopies of contracts, invoices, and bank statements. Landscaping services, pool maintenance, security systems, all going to companies that with some investigation trace back to her brother-in-law, her nephew, and a cousin. The rates are 30 to 40% above market value, and in some cases the work wasn't even completed as contracted. The implications were staggering. Not only had Karen been enforcing rules with arbitrary zeal, but she'd also potentially been enriching her family with community funds for years. Has she been stealing? I asked, flipping through the documents that showed a clear pattern of self-dealing. Walter's expression was grim, the lines in his face deepening as he chose his words carefully. Not technically stealing, more like self-dealing and conflicts of interest that she never disclosed to the board or the community. But the impact on our reserves is substantial. We've overpaid for services by at least $190,000 over the past 5 years. Money that could have gone to actual community improvements or reduce monthly assessments. This explained Karen's desperate attempt to maintain her position and authority. If she lost her role on the board, particularly as treasurer, the financial arrangements she'd established might face scrutiny from less compliant board members. "What are you planning to do?" I asked. Walter sighed heavily, running a hand through his silver hair. "I've scheduled a forensic audit. Once that's complete, the board will need to decide whether to pursue legal action or simply remove her and implement better financial controls." He looked up, his expression troubled. "I wanted you to know, because your conflict with her has become so public. Your tunnel challenge wasn't just about a driveway, it was a threat to her entire operation. The more attention you drew to HOA governance, the more risk to her arrangement." This information changed everything. Karen wasn't just a power-hungry busybody with nothing better to do than enforce arbitrary rules. She had financial motives for maintaining control. Her harassment campaign against me wasn't merely about enforcing rules, it was about eliminating a threat to her comfortable arrangement. I thanked Walter for the information and asked him to keep our conversation confidential for now. With this new perspective, I began formulating a more comprehensive plan, one that would address not just Karen's harassment of my family, but the systemic issues that had allowed her to exploit the community for years. That weekend, Tony and I installed additional security measures around the tunnel and our property. We upgraded the camera system to include night vision and audio recording capabilities, added motion sensors at all entry points, and implemented two-factor authentication for the Tunnel Access app to ensure no unauthorized users could gain entry. "You're preparing for war," Tony observed as we tested the system from his laptop, multiple camera feeds displaying simultaneously on the screen. "Not war," I corrected, watching as the system correctly identified and logged movement at the perimeter. "Just ensuring I'm properly defended before making my move." The difference was significant. I wasn't looking to escalate the conflict or engage in the kind of petty harassment Karen had specialized in. I'd decided against immediate legal action, despite Jessica Reynolds' recommendation for a restraining order. Instead, I would use Karen's own tactics against her, but with one critical difference. Everything I did would be completely legal and documented. I began by leveraging our new tunnel business to connect with homeowners in other HOA-controlled communities. Our consulting work had put us in touch with dozens of people facing similar situations: overbearing board members, selective enforcement, and questionable financial management. Through these connections, I quietly assembled information about vendor relationships, board operations, and financial practices across the region. Patterns emerged, including several communities where Karen's brother-in-law's landscaping company had secured exclusive maintenance contracts shortly after she had consulted with their HOA boards on best practices in vendor management. The more I investigated, the more clear it became that Karen's reach extended beyond our community. She had effectively created a network of influence that channeled HOA funds to family businesses across the county. Next, I contacted a local investigative journalist who had recently published a series on community governance issues. Rebecca Chen had built a reputation for thorough research and fearless reporting on topics most journalists considered too mundane for coverage. Without mentioning names or specific communities, I shared the pattern of self-dealing I'd uncovered, providing anonymized documents that demonstrated the systematic nature of the issue. Rebecca was immediately interested, particularly when I mentioned the scale of the financial impact across multiple communities. This could be happening in HOAs across the county, she noted, reviewing the materials with the practiced eye of someone who had seen similar schemes before. "Would you be willing to go on record with what you found?" I declined direct attribution, but offered to connect her with others who might speak publicly, including Walter if he was willing. "My priority is resolving the issue in my community," I explained, "but I understand this is a larger problem that affects thousands of homeowners." Rebecca agreed to investigate independently, promising to follow journalistic standards that would protect sources while pursuing the larger story. I provided contact information for homeowners in other communities who might be willing to share their experiences, creating a network of information that would make it difficult for Karen or others engaged in similar practices to identify a single source. The story would take time to develop properly. Thorough investigative journalism couldn't be rushed. But the wheels were now in motion for a public reckoning that went beyond our personal conflict with Karen. With these pieces in motion, I prepared for the final phase of my plan. The annual HOA board election was approaching, and Karen was up for re-election as vice president and treasurer. Despite the pending audit, she had already begun campaigning aggressively, sending glossy mailers to every home touting her proven leadership and commitment to property values. Her materials focused primarily on promises to protect property values from unregulated construction and strengthen covenant enforcement. Thinly veiled references to my tunnel and anyone who might consider similar challenges to her authority. The flyers featured before and after photos of homes that had allegedly increased in value due to her strict governance, though I noticed several of the after photos were actually from entirely different neighborhoods. I decided to run against her, not just me, but a slate of reform candidates, including Lisa and 3 other homeowners who had experienced Karen's overreach. We developed a simple platform: financial transparency, reasonable enforcement, and community input on major decisions. Instead of attacking Karen directly, we focused on positive changes and community building. We organized a neighborhood block party, established a community newsletter, and created an online forum for homeowners to discuss issues openly. The contrast in approaches was stark. Karen's campaign emphasized fear and control, while ours centered on transparency and collaboration. We distributed simple campaign materials that highlighted our professional backgrounds and commitment to fair governance, deliberately avoiding any mention of the tunnel or my personal conflict with Karen. This wasn't about me versus Karen. It was about 2 fundamentally different visions of community governance. Our strategy quickly gained traction. Neighbors who had remained quiet during previous HOA conflicts began attending our informal coffee meetings to discuss community improvements. Several shared stories of their own encounters with Karen's selective enforcement. The retired couple who had been fined for a bird feeder that exceeded height restrictions by 2 inches. The young family cited for unapproved exterior decorations when they displayed their child's art project in a front window. The widower who received weekly notices about his lawn maintenance despite hiring professional landscapers. What emerged was a pattern of intimidation that had effectively silenced community participation and created an atmosphere where Karen's decisions went unchallenged out of fear rather than agreement. Karen's response was predictable and swift. Anonymous flyers appeared in mailboxes warning about radical elements seeking to destroy property values and undermine community standards. The materials didn't name me or our slate specifically, but included barely disguised references to tunnel builders and rule breakers who would transform the community into an anything-goes zone where your investment would be at risk. At the pre-election HOA meeting, she abandoned any pretense of professionalism and openly accused me of trying to subvert the covenant through illegal underground activities. Her normally reliable supporters seemed uncomfortable with the intensity of her attacks, especially when she suggested that homes near mine might be at risk of structural damage from tunnel soil disturbances, a claim that directly contradicted the county inspector's assessment and our engineering reports. During her presentation, I noticed Walter watching with an expression that mixed concern and resignation. When it was my turn to speak, I deliberately avoided responding to Karen's accusations. Instead, I focused on our vision for community governance based on transparency, fairness, and collaborative decision-making. I shared specifics about creating a more transparent budgeting process, establishing clear guidelines for covenant enforcement that would be applied consistently, and implementing a community input mechanism for major decisions affecting all homeowners. The contrast in approaches was evident to everyone in the room. One candidate focused on attacking perceived enemies, while the other discussed specific improvements to governance. The night before the election, the local news ran the investigative story about financial mismanagement in regional HOAs. While it didn't name Karen specifically, it detailed exactly the type of vendor self-dealing that Walter had discovered in our community, including quotes from anonymous board members who had discovered similar patterns in their own associations. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more devastating for Karen's campaign. Rebecca Chen's reporting was meticulous, connecting the dots between seemingly unrelated communities and identifying a pattern of contracts flowing to a small network of companies with family connections. As homeowners connected the dots between the news story and our community's situation, questions began flooding the neighborhood forum we'd established. Several residents directly asked if our HOA was one of those featured in the investigation, and whether Karen's family had connections to any of our vendors. On election day, turnout was the highest in community history. Homeowners who had never participated in HOA governance showed up to cast their votes, many stopping by our informal hospitality tent to discuss their concerns about community management. Others shared stories of interactions with Karen that had left them feeling intimidated or unfairly targeted. By evening, the results were clear. Our reform slate had won in a landslide, securing every available position on the board. Karen received the lowest vote total of any candidate, failing to secure even her previous supporters, who had begun to question whether her protection of property values had been more about personal financial benefit than community welfare. The victory was satisfying, but it wasn't the end. At the first meeting of the new board, Walter presented the results of the forensic audit, which had been completed just days after the election. The findings confirmed extensive financial impropriety, including inflated contracts, undisclosed conflicts of interest, and questionable reimbursements for expenses that couldn't be verified. The pattern of self-dealing extended back 7 years, coinciding precisely with Karen's tenure as treasurer. The board unanimously voted to refer the matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal investigation and to pursue civil recovery of misappropriated funds. The community members who attended the meeting, far more than had ever participated before the election, responded with a mix of anger at the deception and relief that it had finally been exposed. Karen didn't attend that meeting. According to neighbors, a moving truck had appeared at her house the previous weekend, with workers loading furniture and belongings under her terse direction. She had sold her home in a private sale and left without saying goodbye to anyone, not even the few board members who had consistently supported her initiatives. Rumor had it she'd relocated to Arizona, perhaps to escape the mounting legal troubles or simply to flee the community where her authority had evaporated. The for sale sign never appeared on her lawn. The transaction had been conducted quietly, much like her financial dealings with HOA vendors. With Karen gone and a new board in place, we began implementing our reform agenda. First, we revised the covenant to eliminate unnecessary restrictions, focusing on essential standards that genuinely protected property values while removing arbitrary rules that served no practical purpose. We established transparent financial processes, including competitive bidding for all vendor contracts, public disclosure of board members' potential conflicts of interest, and regular financial reviews by an independent accountant. Most importantly, we created a more collaborative approach to community governance, establishing advisory committees of homeowners to provide input on major decisions, and creating an appeals process for enforcement actions that homeowners considered unfair or inconsistent. The tunnel that had started it all became a community talking point, with regular tours for curious neighbors and even occasional visits from other homeowners associations looking to understand our approach to property rights and community standards. What had begun as a personal solution to Karen's blockade had evolved into a symbol of creative problem-solving that inspired others to reconsider rigid enforcement in favor of reasonable accommodation. Several neighboring communities, after touring our tunnel and hearing our story, began reviewing their own covenants to eliminate outdated or overly restrictive provisions. Tony and I continued developing our underground solutions business, expanding beyond physical construction to include consulting on property rights, HOA governance, and conflict resolution. The demand for our services grew steadily as homeowners across the region sought ways to address similar challenges in their own communities. We published a guide called Know Your Rights: Homeownership in the Age of HOAs that became surprisingly popular in planned communities across the country, offering practical advice on navigating covenant restrictions, understanding property rights, and advocating for fair governance. The tunnel that had begun as a personal solution to a specific problem had evolved into something much larger, a symbol of creative resistance to unreasonable authority and a catalyst for reform in communities far beyond our own. 6 months after the election, we received an unexpected letter. It was from Karen, postmarked from Scottsdale, Arizona, where she'd apparently settled after leaving our community. The envelope contained no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably hers, the same precise, controlled script that had appeared on countless violation notices over the years. "I want you to know that I always acted in what I believed was the best interest of the community," she wrote, the defensive tone evident even in her careful phrasing. "The standards I enforced were designed to protect all of us. Without them, I fear Oakwood Estates will lose its special character and ultimately its value. Time will prove me right." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the financial improprieties or personal harassment that had ultimately led to her departure, just a final defense of her actions and a dire prediction about the community's future without her oversight. I showed the letter to Lisa, who read it silently before handing it back with a slight shake of her head. "Some people never learn," she observed, glancing out the window at our thriving neighborhood where children now played freely on front lawns that Karen had once scrutinized for blade height violations. "Even now, she can't see that the community is thriving without her rules." She was right. Since the governance changes, property values in Oakwood Estates had remained stable. New families had moved in, attracted by the reputation for being welcoming rather than restrictive, and community events saw record participation. The character Karen had so zealously tried to protect through enforcement hadn't disappeared. It had flourished once freed from her control. 1 year to the day after we completed our tunnel, we hosted a neighborhood tunniversary celebration. Neighbors gathered in our backyard, sharing stories and laughing about the Karen era that now seemed like a distant memory despite having ended just months earlier. Noah and Emma proudly gave tours of the tunnel to younger children, describing it as if it were an historic monument to freedom rather than a simple alternative driveway. "This is where we defeated the HOA tyrant," Noah explained to a group of wide-eyed children, his dramatic retelling earning amused smiles from parents who remembered the actual events. Emma, now more confident after Karen's departure had eliminated the source of her fears, demonstrated the electronic access system to her friends, explaining how it worked with the solemnity of a museum curator. As dusk fell and neighbors lingered over dessert and conversation, Walter approached me with a glass raised in toast. His retirement from the board had come shortly after the election, his final act being the presentation of the forensic audit findings that had confirmed Karen's financial improprieties. "You know," he said quietly, "when you first built that tunnel, I thought you were either crazy or a genius. I'm now convinced it was the latter. He gestured toward the gathered community, where conversations flowed freely among neighbors who had barely interacted during Karen's reign. This wasn't just about beating Karen or fixing the HOA. You showed people they don't have to accept unreasonable authority, that there are creative ways to stand your ground without endless conflict. I hadn't thought of it that way, but he was right. The tunnel had become more than a physical structure. It represented an idea that had transformed our community. The reality of seeing an alternative path had empowered others to question restrictions they had previously accepted without challenge. Sometimes the most effective resistance isn't direct confrontation, but finding an unexpected path forward, a way around obstacles that others assume are impenetrable. I just wanted to get my car out of the garage, I reminded him with a smile. Walter chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The most significant changes often begin with the simplest necessities. You needed a driveway. You created a movement. Later that evening, as Lisa and I cleaned up after the party, she wrapped her arms around me from behind as I loaded the dishwasher. "Remember when I thought this whole tunnel idea was crazy?" She laughed, resting her chin on my shoulder. "I was so worried about making waves, about not fitting in." I turned to face her, struck by how much had changed in a single year. "And now?" She smiled, glancing out the window at our transformed community where children played freely and adults gathered in spontaneous conversation. "Now, I understand that sometimes making waves is exactly what's needed. The right kind of disruption can change everything for the better." The legal proceedings against Karen continued for another year, eventually resulting in a settlement, where she repaid a significant portion of the misappropriated funds without admitting wrongdoing, a technicality that allowed her to avoid criminal charges, while still making financial restitution to the community. The district attorney, faced with limited resources and more violent crimes demanding attention, had accepted the civil settlement as sufficient resolution. The money was used to improve community amenities, including a playground renovation that Emma helped design with colorful equipment, replacing the dated structures Karen had insisted were classic and appropriate, and a basketball court upgrade that Noah championed, complete with adjustable hoops for younger players that Karen had previously rejected as visually inconsistent with community standards. The features that Karen had once micromanaged as potential threats to property values became central to the community's appeal and identity, attracting young families who valued active, engaged neighborhoods over sterile conformity. Our tunnel business expanded to include workshops on community governance and homeowner rights, with Tony focusing on the technical and legal aspects, while I shared our experience navigating HOA conflicts. We helped several communities transition from authoritarian HOA structures to more collaborative models, always emphasizing the balance between individual rights and community interests. The tunnel itself became something of a tourist attraction for homeowner rights advocates, with visitors from across the country stopping by to see the now legendary structure that had sparked a movement. Some came simply out of curiosity, others seeking inspiration for their own conflicts with unreasonable governance. We welcomed them all, sharing our story and emphasizing that the goal wasn't to eliminate community standards, but to ensure they served the actual community rather than the power trips of individual board members. 3 years after the tunnel's construction, a national magazine featured our story in an article titled "The Underground Revolution: How One Family's Driveway Changed Suburban Governance." The piece detailed not just our conflict with Karen, but the broader impact our approach had inspired in communities facing similar issues. It included interviews with homeowners from several states who had successfully challenged unreasonable restrictions after learning about our tunnel strategy. The article ended with a quote from me that summed up the lesson we'd learned through our confrontation with Karen and its unexpected outcomes. Authority without accountability inevitably leads to abuse. The real foundation of any community isn't rigid rules, it's mutual respect and creative problem solving. The magazine feature brought another wave of attention to our community and business, including an invitation to speak at a national conference on property rights and community governance. The audience included attorneys, real estate developers, and HOA board members looking to avoid the pitfalls that had plagued our community under Karen's leadership. My presentation focused not on demonizing HOAs, they served valuable functions when properly managed, but on creating governance structures that balanced necessary standards with reasonable flexibility and homeowner input. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several communities subsequently adopting our model of transparent finances, clear enforcement guidelines, and community advisory committees. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if I should thank Karen. Her unreasonable barricade had not only prompted our creative solution, but had ultimately led to a stronger, more cohesive community than we could have imagined. The obstacles she placed in our path had become the catalyst for transformation, not just for our family, but for homeowners everywhere facing similar challenges. Without her blockade, we would never have discovered the subterranean rights that made our tunnel possible. Without her harassment, we might never have investigated the financial improprieties that had drained community resources for years. Without her rigid enforcement, we might never have recognized the value of flexible, collaborative governance. In her determination to maintain control, she had inadvertently created the conditions for a complete reimagining of how communities could function. As for the tunnel itself, it remained a perfectly functional alternative driveway, used daily by our family and occasionally by neighbors who needed temporary access during their own home renovations or special events. But its significance had far exceeded its practical purpose. It stood as a monument to the power of creative thinking, a reminder that when faced with unreasonable barriers, the best solution might not be to break through them head-on, but to find an unexpected path around, or in our case, underneath. The physical structure was impressive in its engineering, but the idea it represented had proven even more durable and far-reaching. It had become a symbol of empowerment for homeowners who had previously believed they had no recourse against unreasonable authority. Last month, we received a final update from the prosecutor's office. Karen had completed her community service requirements, 200 hours at a homeless shelter in Scottsdale where she presumably had to follow someone else's rules for a change, and paid the last installment of her settlement to our community association. The case was officially closed. That evening, I took a solitary drive through our tunnel, the soft lighting illuminating the smooth concrete walls as I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. What had begun as a simple act of defiance had evolved into something much more meaningful, a testament to the possibility of positive change, even in the most entrenched systems. As I emerged from the tunnel onto Maple Street, I noticed new families enjoying the community park that had once been subject to Karen's restrictive rules about usage hours and acceptable activities. Children played freely, neighbors chatted on benches, and a community bulletin board announced upcoming events organized by engaged residents. The transformation wasn't just in our physical environment, but in the community spirit. Where fear and conformity had once prevailed, creativity and connection now flourished. The property values Karen had been so obsessed with protecting had indeed remained stable, but the quality of life had improved immeasurably. If you find yourself facing your own Karen or struggling against seemingly immovable obstacles, remember that creativity often trumps confrontation. The most effective solution might not be the most obvious one. Sometimes you need to dig deeper, think differently, and find your own tunnel through the problem. And when you do, don't keep the blueprint to yourself. Share it with others facing similar challenges. Real change happens not just when we solve our own problems, but when we help others discover they have the power to do the same. In the end, our story wasn't really about a tunnel at all. It was about reclaiming our community through unexpected means. It was about discovering that sometimes the path to justice isn't a straight line, but a creative detour that changes everything along the way. And most importantly, it was about learning that when faced with unreasonable authority, the most powerful response isn't matched aggression, but innovative thinking that transforms the entire landscape. So the next time someone puts up a barricade in your path, ask yourself, what's my tunnel? What creative solution exists that they haven't anticipated? Because in that space between the problem and the obvious response lies the potential for transformation that goes well beyond simply getting from point A to point B. It's in that space that ordinary disagreements can become extraordinary opportunities for change. And that, perhaps, is the greatest revenge of all.